Hello, my name is Dr. Emma Conliff of Blue Shield International, and I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about our work with armed forces. So I'll share my screen with you now. Okay, so I'm going to talk about how Blue Shield does civil and military cultural property protection. I think you're probably familiar with us, given you're at a Blue Shield conference, but just so you know, the Blue Shield is an NGO, non-governmental organization, established in 1996, dedicated to the protection of cultural, natural, and intangible heritage from conflicts and disasters. We have 33 national committees around the world, with 9 more in formation at the moment, an international board and its secretariat called Blue Shield International, and we were founded by and work closely with the International Committee of Museums, the International Committee on Monuments and Sites, the International Federation of Library Associations, and the International Council of Archives. We're named after the distinctive protective emblem in the Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflict, signed in 1954, that identifies cultural property and people dedicated to its protection in the convention. And you can see the distinctive emblem on the slide. Now, that convention has a second protocol from 1999, which names the International Committee of the Blue Shield, BSI, as an expert advisory body. So we have a role in international law advising the Intergovernmental Committee for Cultural Property Protection in the event of armed conflict. Our primary context is the 1954 Hague Convention and its protocols, but that is underpinned by wider international humanitarian law and the laws of armed conflict, but also the UN and UNESCO's agendas and international initiatives like the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. Now, the Hague Convention tells us that the protection of cultural property in conflicts comprises the safeguarding of and respect for cultural property, and that's underpinned by the laws of armed conflict, so it doesn't exist in isolation. And all of our work leads towards really those two goals about safeguarding cultural property and respect for it. So we have 6 areas of activity, which I'll just give you a brief overview. Obviously, we coordinate between ourselves, and you see one of our reports on the slide, but also with our partner organizations. We don't work in isolation. So, for example, we have a letter of intent with NATO Shape J9, one in development with UNESCO. We have a memorandum of understanding with the peacekeeping force, UNIFIL, in Lebanon, and another with the ICRC. We do a lot of capacity building, education and training in support of these areas of activity. And you see here a Georgian course about safeguarding heritage in crisis. I lead on a lot of our legal compliance. How does the Hague Convention work in practice? What policies can we make regarding to it? And how can states implement it better? And that's both safeguarding and the military obligations. We do a lot of proactive protection and risk preparedness. You see Blue Shield France here training firefighters, because safeguarding is the measures states are meant to take before conflict to prepare their cultural property if conflict happens. And that's equally valuable in a disaster. Obviously, we do emergency response. You can see here a fire in Peru, which our Peruvian committee responded to help rescue cultural objects inside a historic church. And that also means we do field missions. So, for example, responding to requests from areas and conflicts and disaster from governments and heritage professionals. After the explosion in the port of Beirut in 2020, then President Karl von Habsburg was on the ground within hours of the explosion. Our Director of Operations, Dr. Dela Cruz, went out in person to areas affected by the earthquake and conflict in Syria and Turkey, together with the Turkish National Committee last year. It means we also go out to the front lines of conflict. So responding to requests from the Ukrainian government to support capacity building in the implementation of international humanitarian law. We've had at least 3 missions to Ukraine, where the Director of Operations has viewed affected cultural heritage. He's met communities near the front lines to understand their needs, and met with heritage organisations like the Heritage Emergency Response Initiative to assess the management needs for evacuated collections. We know heritage is going to become a target in situations like this. So we need to better understand how to support the implementation of international law in practice. And that means for us, it's not just a heritage issue. The people we meet with are people like the Principal Deputy National Security Advisor, the Commanding General for the Territorial Defence Forces, and other senior Ministry of Defence staff members to discuss the protection of Ukrainian heritage as a national security issue in the conflict. We pledged to work together to establish a cultural property protection capability in the Ukrainian military, to provide assistance in developing forensic data collection methods so that the Ukrainians can investigate heritage crimes, and support the development of an analytical capability within their civil military forces to address cultural property protection issues. And then we do a lot of work in stabilization, post-disaster recovery, and long-term activities. We have a countering trafficking working group, and we support the OSCE Heritage Crime Task Force training. But we also then run a lot of workshops. I lead on these. How can we protect cultural property better? I'll talk about some examples of some of these workshops in a moment. But just to show you, for example, we run workshops on scripting. How can we script military exercises that give good cultural property protection challenges to develop understanding? How can we wargame cultural property protection? What about things that are not cultural property? How can we protect sacred landscape? What do risk assessments look like in military missions, and how can we factor cultural value into those? And I'll give some examples of this sort of work now. So military training. Well, we deal with that in 4 areas. We train peacekeepers, we train national forces, we train multinational forces, and we do a lot of civil military cooperation. So the Hague Convention, Article 7.2, says that armed forces are required to cooperate with the competent authorities responsible for safeguarding heritage. And that means the governments and heritage owners and managers who are responsible for cultural heritage. And that isn't something you can just know how that cooperation works. What are its boundaries? Who do you need to talk to? So that cooperation is something else that we teach and train under international law. And central to our approach is the understanding of risk. So when we as heritage professionals, and I'm an archaeologist by background, when we as heritage professionals think about threats to cultural property in conflict, we think about the direct threats to sites and buildings and collections, to structural damage, fire, looting, neglect if we can't get there and remove pests from our collections. We might think about secondary effects, like if the power goes down and the environmental regulation fails. But we're focused on site and object protection. And usually we're focused on how we can protect things in situ without evacuating them. We're disaster focused, not conflict focused. So we tend to assume that staff are present. The resources we have now are those that are available. But actually in conflict, funding is hugely cut to the cultural sector. We assume emergency services will attend. But again, in conflict, you can assume maybe 1/3 of them will be present and you're not the priority, that your staff actually are not present. Maybe they're killed, maybe they're displaced, maybe they have inherited caring responsibilities and they can't attend. So the way we plan for our threats is site-focused and is not conflict-focused. Armed forces, on the other hand, think about the risk to the mission. They're not there to protect cultural property. They have a mission to achieve. And so for them, they'll think about cultural property in terms of mission risk. And it's about reframing the problem. So they don't want illegal action. So you need to understand the very basics of international law. When is damage to cultural property legal and illegal? And what can cause that damage? So how can we prevent it? What will give them freedom to maneuver? Looting isn't about loss of cultural objects. It's about organized crime and terrorist financing. There are negative information campaigns. So, for example, in Iraq, obviously the sacking of Iraq's National Museum in 2003 hit the headlines, and the US was widely blamed for that, rightly or wrongly. And then 20 years later, that's still in the headlines. Armed forces have occupation responsibilities, and they'll want to know what cultural property is most significant to the mission. So to give an example on this slide, that mosque is the Al-Askari Mosque in Samarra. It's one of the holiest Shia shrines in Iraq, and it was bombed in 2006. Now, the day after it was bombed, 32 mosques were bombed in reprisal bombings, and there was a huge increase in troop and civilian casualties. It had a major impact on the military mission. So we need to think about what sites are not just culturally significant, but about what we call flashpoints that can really ignite a conflict. And I'll give an example shortly. And then we need to show how successful cultural property protection, I should say, is a mission enabler. It's a benefit. So in NATO Operation Unified Protector in Libya in 2011, UNESCO and US Blue Shield gave NATO a list of cultural property to protect. NATO found 6 radar vehicles, you can see one of them marked in red there, as listening stations. And NATO were going to destroy the whole area with 1 missile, but then their system looked at the protected list and said, oh, it's right next to this Roman and later Italian building called Ras Al Mergheb, and that's marked there in white. So the targeting boards reconvene, because there's a process for targeting. Can this threat be avoided? No, they decide the strike is necessary. We need to remove these listening posts. So then they look at the weaponeering options. Can they do it differently to cause less damage? And they decide that the radar stations will be attacked individually with small caliber precision weapons, minimizing collateral damage. It's more expensive, it's slower, there's more chance of failure, but it will protect the site. And as you can see here, the listening stations are destroyed, the site is protected. And it generated major good press for NATO. It was really well received, and they were very positive. And this is actually where a lot of NATO's interest in cultural protection stems from. In my work, I also, as one of our trainers, I need to understand what policies and doctrines cultural property protection might be part of. And that's not just a cultural property protection policy, although NATO has one, a buy-side directive for cultural protection. But actually, it's part of other doctrine, stability policing, targeting, peace support, and others. It's part of their protection of civilians policy, where the protection of civilians can include not only civilians, but civilian objects. And that can include both ensuring NATO do not harm them adversely, but also actively protecting them if necessary. And then for NATO, this sits in what we call human security. And human security has kind of 6 aspects, which also includes protection of civilians and cultural property protection. But when I teach, this is one of my slides for NATO. There are 9 aspects to human security, and it's not just about cultural objects. Think bigger. Food is a big aspect of human security. Well, there are 9 foods on UNESCO's Intangible Cultural Heritage List, so protected under the Intangible Heritage Laws. Health is an aspect. Now, the International Organization of Migration, who deal with refugees, found that 73% of refugees they interviewed from Rohingya identified loss of cultural identity as a main factor of their distress. And so the IOM put in programming to help bolster cultural identity. Environment, we have UNESCO cultural landscapes, we have geoparks, we have wetlands. These protect, and we have natural World Heritage sites. The aspects of the environment that are related to culture are huge and they're important. There are big economic impacts. The UK creative industries contributes 13 million an hour to the UK. At one point in Egypt, tourism was about 90% of its economy. Take that away and you have widespread poverty and unrest. Obviously, we can see in the war in Ukraine at the moment, there are big political aspects to nationhood, to statehood, to identity. There are personal aspects. We must never forget the heritage workers and the artists, the bearers of intangible heritage. Religious figures might be at risk if there's a religious aspect to the conflict. And the community itself might be what is at risk. The Islamic State specifically and systematically targeted culture, identity, and heritage of Iraqi Yazidis. Historic sites and holy places were destroyed. So once we understand the context we're working in, then we can think about what protection looks like. And I'm going to give you an example of one of our workshops looking at heritage and risk. 2018, we had syndicates of heritage professionals and soldiers who were, each syndicate was a staff officer in a military brigade. They were deployed to stabilize a fictional country called Danubia, which looks a lot like the historic center of Vienna, but we have to pretend it's Danubia, where there is a growing civil war. The brigade staff officer has responsibility for cultural property protection. So we took syndicates to the HGM, the military musician, where they had a tour from the curator, pretending we're in this fictional conflict, to assess the risk to the museum and to the mission. And this was part of a workshop run every other year by the German Bundeswehr called Coping with Culture. So firstly, we thought about cultural risk. From a heritage perspective, what is the most important item in the collection? Well, actually, it's this hot air balloon. It dates to the Napoleonic Wars, which is the early 1800s. And it's the first one of its kind, and it marks the advent of aerial warfare. And I didn't even notice it in my tour. So that firstly taught me a lot about coming in with my preconceptions. But what about socially valuable? Well, right at the back of the large photo, you can see two banners hanging from the ceiling. Now, in reality, people come from Turkey to pray under these banners. They were taken from the Ottoman Empire at its defeat at the walls of Vienna, and they're still really significant to people today. So you can imagine how in a ethnically charged conflict, items with such great social significance could become flashpoints. And then, of course, it's a military museum. It has a large number of weapons and tanks, which, because it is owned by the Ministry of Defence, are live. They'd be easy to get going, and they are not held to the same security as other military compounds, as items in military compounds. We do national training. So this is an example from our support to the UK Ministry of Defence Cultural Property Protection Special to Arms course in 2019, where UK Blue Shield was one of the course directors. So obviously huge input into the content of the course, but I and my intern and Peter Stone attended the field exercise where we were local residents and refugees because we needed to highlight the human element that cultural property does not exist in isolation. So as a refugee, I was there trying to persuade them that I had nothing and why were they giving money to look after this old building, which they were there to do a damage assessment of, and couldn't I have some help? And so because they have to learn to deal with those kinds of complications. We run an annual peacekeeping training course with the UN Peacekeeping Training School in Ireland, which has very high ratings. I'm not going to talk much about it. It's running again towards the end of this year. I'm going to just spend my last couple of minutes talking about NATO. We've worked closely with them since 2011. We have our formal letter of intent with J9, which is the civil military branch, and an action plan we developed with the civil military branch this year. Today, we support multiple Article 4 and Article 5 exercises and seminars, as well as workshops and support to cultural property protection policy development. Primarily what we do is what we call command post exercises, training and exercises for senior staff, where we test their obligations based on real world situations. The civil military branch is the lead, but it's what we call cross-cutting. We need people to understand that it affects multiple branches in the headquarters. It affects intelligence, obviously targeting, but also logistics. Can I drive here? Can I store something here? It's part of operations and planning, and it's part of strategic communications. And then it's cross-cutting outside the branch as well. What about the civil stakeholders, the government, the heritage owners, and the managers? It affects strategy, it affects operations, and it affects tactical decisions on the ground. And it's not just about land, but also about air and sea. We train that it's an activity that feeds into operational planning and it should support the commander's decision-making process. It shouldn't just be a passive part of the exercise. So this is an example from an exercise in 2018, where the red hashed area is called Kalmar, and it's a breakaway province in Arnland. NATO are deployed to help Arnland stabilize the situation. And on the edge there, you can see an island with terrorists on it. So NATO have decided they're going to do an amphibious, so a water-based operation onto the island. But then they realize that actually about a third of that is a World Heritage Site. And they didn't realize at first, because if you download the coordinates from UNESCO, you get a center point. But Blue Shield is supporting the government and the exercise have said, well, actually, you need to understand how big it is. So then we have what we call a main line of effort supporting this exercise, supporting this amphibious operation. How can we protect the area? And it's a big planning operation to make sure the World Heritage Site is protected whilst achieving the goal. The other thing they have to do is help evacuate the museum. Now, there's not only that requirement in the Hague Convention that calls for civil-military cooperation, but the second protocol actually specifically says that armed forces will help evacuate collections if they haven't already been evacuated, and far too often we know they're not. So they had to hold this huge planning meeting. It's cross-branch. There's intelligence. What are the threats to the museum if it stays in place, if it moves? There's the host nation. Arnland are very keenly involved. There's the brigade who will be doing the actual moving, the logistics planner, the legal advisor, the training team, because it is an exercise. The police, maybe the NATO police, they might have to escort it. Plans and operations, because this is going to be a huge plan. And then civil military relations and strategic communications and information operations. They're going to have to think about mechanical handling. They don't know anything about packing up a museum. Where do they get that information? About security, about the military convoy escort, and where on earth is it even going? This is a big planning operation that they have to work through. So I've given you a bit of an overview of our military planning. So kind of things to sum up. To engage with armed forces, firstly, I haven't really talked about it, but be realistic. Know what you are asking to be protected. It's not realistic to protect thousands of sites. Understand the basics of the law. Parts that relate to the 1954 Hague Convention relating to legal and illegal targeting are customary, applicable to all parties. And you have to understand that sometimes targeting is legal. Understand how your goals and theirs align. What policies is it part of? What is the military point of view? How can cultural property protection decrease mission risk? It's not just about loss of heritage. And I'd like to finish by saying Blue Shield International is always available to assist. Thank you very much.